I'm Simon. I've been investing in property for over 20 years, and if you're an active landlord or planning your next property investment, this podcast is for you. I'd like to repeat my request for topic suggestions or any questions you may have for things that you would like to see covered in this podcast in the future. If you have any ideas or anything you'd like to suggest, please email me. You can reach me on show@thebusinessofproperty.com. This episode is a follow-up to last week, really, answering a couple of questions I've received about what I was discussing then. So if you haven't listened to the episode last week, it would probably make sense to go back and listen to that episode before listening to the rest of this one, because I am going to be referencing a lot of things from last week and assuming that you already know what I'm talking about. However, before I get into that, I would like to mention some PaTMa news. So PaTMa Prospector, which is a software system to help you find, analyze, and plan your next property investment, had a huge update last week. I always want PaTMa to be as quick and easy to use as possible, and this update has made it much easier to consider multiple potential strategies for a single property. Previously, that was possible, but harder than it should have been. And now it really is much easier. And along with that, it's also much clearer to see what each of those plans sort of actually include. Whether you're looking for a family let, an HMO, or maybe a flip type project, you can now easily check the different finance options, whether you want to include a refurb or refinance sort of in that process or not, as you choose. And those effects, those results on your financial forecast are reflected instantly. So you can see in real time while you're sort of experimenting with the numbers exactly what will happen. And then when you think you've got it right and how things could work, you can then very easily just save that. If you've already got a PaTMa account and your free trial has expired, then please just drop an email to support@patma.co.uk and I'll arrange a new 7-day trial so you can see these new features in action. And of course, if you haven't already got a PaTMa account, you can just go to patma.co.uk and sign up for a free trial straight away. One more thing to mention before I get onto the questions I've received is that I haven't had any requests to rerun this sort of model for other areas and other property types, or maybe even other strategies. And I think this really would be quite an interesting experiment. And in fact, I think I'm probably going to touch on some of the reasons why that might be a bit later on from what I am going to talk about today. But if you have a particular area in mind or property type that you'd like to see this model applied to and see how it could work and how it could make £1 million, or could have in the past made £1 million as a property investment strategy, then please do let me know. You can, as I said already, reach me on show@thebusinessofproperty.com. Getting to the questions then. First of all, thank you, Scott, for sending these in. And the first question, hopefully easier to answer, and that was I describing my own portfolio in the sort of example that I used last week on how to make £1 million from buy-to-let property? And the short answer is no. Unfortunately, I did a number of things differently. So I started my investment portfolio a bit earlier than the example and scenario I used last week. And I've also generally done refurbs. However, a couple of big things that I think affected how things turned out for me is one, that I had a big gap in my investment time and sort of my building of my portfolio, because I decided to spend my savings on buying an expensive family home and generally an expensive family. So as families I think often are. So that meant that savings weren't available to go into building my investment portfolio. However, perhaps one of the things that I think affected it more, certainly in terms of the raw £1 million being made, is that some of my investments are in cheaper areas. So even if they may have performed just as well sort of on a percentage gain level, the growth in terms of pounds, and hence making £1 million from the portfolio, is less, and it's quite significantly less, really. So I think that does make a big effect. And that's, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons why I think it would be interesting to rerun the scenario with other property types and in other areas, and hence looking at other sort of growth profiles and other pounds amounts. Because you may well be able to purchase more properties and faster, but it would be interesting to see how that plays off against the reduced pounds increase per property. The second question is, I think, a bit more interesting, and also something I was sort of wanting to try and touch on anyway, or try and sort of cover in a future episode. So I'm going to do it this week. And that is, how can this model be applied going forward? Or how can you make £1 million from a buy-to-let property portfolio in the future? Now, as I said last week, I didn't initially choose to create this as a forward-looking model, because there would be a lot more assumptions involved, and you can't obviously tell what's going to happen in the future. You can't tell what's going to happen in the future very close to you, never mind looking out 18 or 20 years for this to actually play out as a full investment portfolio. So this, I think, is going to be a very much sort of, well, it's obviously a lot more guesswork, but I've tried to keep it sort of similar to the previous scenario. So I have assumed that property growth is going to follow the same pattern. It obviously won't really, but maybe it will be close. There were ups and there were downs in the last 18 years that happened to be covered. And if you subscribe to the 18-year property cycle theory, maybe you might actually be more confident in saying that the next 18 years will be extremely similar to the last 18 years. I don't know whether that'll be the case, but that's what I've gone with for looking at this model going forwards. Of course, interest rates will also play a big part in how things will play out. And again, I have assumed that they're just going to repeat in the same pattern as they did previously. There are definitely some flaws with this. As it happens, the starting interest rate that we're looking at is not vastly different from the interest rate we're looking at now. And then, of course, interest rates did go down a bit from there before, quite a lot down. I don't think that's going to happen again this time. I don't think we're going to get back down to periods of near zero interest rate, certainly not for a long period of near zero interest rates. So there's definitely some inaccuracies in that part of this model. You'll have to sort of take that as you wish, and the spreadsheet is going to be linked again in the show notes. So you're very welcome to have a look at the spreadsheet, have a look at the calculations I've used, make a copy of the spreadsheet, and adjust the numbers and see how they might actually turn out if you treat them perhaps more realistically, at least from an interest rate point of view. So mortgages now, I think, are harder to get than they were 18, 20 years ago. So we've got more complicated and higher rental cover requirements, and hence you need to put higher deposits in, although you can probably still make them work, maybe with a 75% loan to value. And certainly that's what I've continued to assume in this model. But they are definitely harder to get than they were looking back into the historic version of this model. But of course, the big difference starting now versus starting 18, 20 years ago is that the raw pound price of property is much higher. So we're now looking at the sort of price at the end of the last scenario rather than the price at the beginning of that scenario. So the historic one was looking at property prices starting around the sort of 280,000 mark. And then by the end of that 18-year period, they'd gone up in the area we were looking at to over £650,000 for the same kind of property. And that's a huge difference in pounds amount. And of course, when you adjust for inflation or other factors, that huge increase is not going to be as meaningful. But in pounds, and we're looking at making £1 million from buy to let, then the pounds matter. So for this scenario looking forwards, I've obviously had to start with a much higher property price. And I've gone with 650,000. I think that's sort of reasonably realistic for looking in the area I was considering and the type of property I was considering for a purchase now-ish. And then, as I said, I've used the same growth pattern as the past 18 years to forecast values going forwards. Now, of course, because you're buying with a much higher pound value property, you are, of course, needing a much higher pound value deposit. And in the previous model, the previous scenario we were considering, it was all based around being able to save £15,000 from a salary, a day job, other income, etc., and using that, collecting that up, and then putting it into deposits in order to buy properties based on a 75% loan to value. Seeing as we're buying properties that are so much more expensive, that just doesn't work at all in a model going forwards. You cannot make this work if you're only saving £15,000 a year. So I've had to revise that number. And I kind of based the number I've ended up with around sort of what would work. So I wanted to try and achieve a similar kind of purchase rate for the portfolio and still end up with 4 properties at the end of it. And obviously throughout the process, you have to not run out of money. So the saving amount per year is kind of reverse engineered a bit in this scenario, rather than taking a forward consideration of thinking what would have been reasonable as a savings rate, and hence what would be achievable in an investment portfolio for that. This time I have kind of looked at it the other way around. And hence I'm not totally convinced it's a reasonable or realistic savings amount. But the number I've ended up with for this model looking forwards is a whole £40,000 per year. So, I mean, if you've got an average UK salary of 35 to 40,000 in that region, clearly you're not going to be able to save your entire salary and put it into a property portfolio. However, if you're at the higher earning end, where perhaps your salary is 80,000 and maybe you've got a partner who's also earning similar, then it is, I think, achievable that you could, or at least feasible, perhaps I should say, that you could save £40,000 a year and do that consistently over time in order to build a portfolio. Now, I think that does make this a little less achievable, a little less reachable going forwards for this scenario and this model, but possible. So a quick summary of what you end up with. Again, it takes 4.5 years of savings before you can buy your first property. And then when you do buy your first property, it's then another 4 years and another 4 years and another 4 years before you can add to the portfolio. However, because we're dealing with much bigger numbers, sort of going into the portfolio, you actually make £1 million from buy to let after only 14 years. So you make it faster. Of course, unfortunately, £1 million isn't what it used to be. And once we've added another 14 years, it'll be even less of what it used to be. So I'm focusing and fixing on the £1 million from buy to let. And hence, that's what I've used again. But of course, it's not quite the same. However, if you keep going out to the full 18 years, then you do end up with about £2.5 million being made from buy-to-let, from this potential buy-to-let portfolio. And again, I'll just mention that this imaginary portfolio is a very passive portfolio. It's buying properties at market value. It's not doing refurbishments. It's not doing anything fancy. It's only building a portfolio of 4 properties, so you haven't got a huge amount of maintenance and sort of headache involved in keeping the portfolio running. And yet, due to capital gains, house price appreciation effectively, and rental income over that time period, in 18 years, you could, perhaps, if the assumptions in this model turn out to be roughly right, build a quite sizable property portfolio, as in sizable in value, of 4 family homes in a good area, and in the process make £2.5 million. So I think that's quite remarkable that it is still possible. It's definitely harder. There are definitely more challenges. You definitely have to have a higher savings rate in order to be able to make this work and to build this. But it's doable. It does work. The numbers do show that it is achievable. There are lots of assumptions, lots of extra assumptions in this forward-looking version of this model versus the one last week. So I would be interested. I'm very curious to hear your feedback and your thoughts on how you can look forwards for such a long period of time and come up with any kind of idea of what might be achievable, what could be the sort of financial future of your portfolio. If you have ideas or thoughts around that, or as I said at the beginning of this episode, suggestions on other areas that I could use this model for to investigate other possibilities, please do email me, show@thebusinessofproperty.com. And I hope this sort of hypothetical look forwards rather than the realistic look backwards from last week has been interesting for you. And I will talk to you again next week.